When you spend years caring for others, you are called kind. When you give the last of your money, you are called generous. When you do laundry, cook, babysit children while they live their lives, you are called helpful. And when you're inconvenient, they just forget to call you. They threw a party for my great-granddaughter with balloons, cake, pink tulle garlands, with pictures in a ribbon where the happiness looked rehearsed. And in all those pictures, not a single memory of me. Though it was in my house that her footsteps first sounded across the floor, it was my arms that rocked her at night while her mother tired of mothering in screens and cocktails. I didn't make a scene. I didn't cry. I didn't call asking why. I just opened the drawer, I took out a folder, and I took one single step that they never saw coming. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Martha Winslow. I was 81 years old and had spent most of my life in a small town outside of Des Moines, Iowa. I worked as a school librarian for over 40 years, the kind of job that suited me, quiet, dependable, surrounded by stories. After I retired, I stayed in the same brick house where I had raised my son and later helped raise my granddaughter. It wasn't grand, but it was mine, and I filled it with books, framed photographs, and the kind of silence you learn to love when everyone else has moved on. That morning began like most others. I brewed a pot of coffee, fed my cat, and read the newspaper with the radio playing softly in the background. I liked routine. It gave the day shape, structure. And at my age, anything predictable was a comfort. It wasn't until early afternoon, after I finished folding laundry and sat down with my tablet, that something caught my eye. A notification blinked on the screen. A photo shared by my granddaughter. I tapped it without much thought. And there she was, my great-granddaughter Lucy, smiling from ear to ear, wearing a sparkly dress and a tiara too big for her little head. The caption read, "Our sweet Lucy turned 6 today. Magical day with our people." I stared at the image, my finger frozen on the glass. Behind her were balloons, decorations, a table stacked with gifts, a cake shaped like a castle. There were other photos, too. Her parents, my granddaughter and her husband, beaming as they helped her blow out the candles. Friends, neighbors, even distant cousins I barely knew. But not me. I wasn't in a single photo. I wasn't mentioned. I hadn't even known there was a party. At first, I thought maybe the celebration was scheduled for later, that I'd missed an early post. I checked my messages. Nothing. No text. No call. No email. I scrolled through my calendar, wondering if I had somehow marked the wrong date. But no, this was the day, her actual birthday, and I hadn't been invited. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was small. Maybe they assumed I wouldn't want to come. But the photos told another story. There were at least 20 people in the background of one shot, all smiling, all gathered around Lucy. It wasn't a quiet family dinner. It was a party, a celebration, and I hadn't been included. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not pain, exactly, but something heavier. A weight pressing inward. I sat very still, trying to understand what had happened, trying to figure out what I had done to warrant being forgotten, or worse, deliberately excluded. Memories came rushing in. I remembered holding Lucy the day she was born, swaddled tightly in a pale green blanket, her tiny face wrinkled and red. I remembered walking her up and down the hallway when she couldn't sleep, humming lullabies until she finally closed her eyes. I remembered babysitting for hours while her mother went back to school, packing snacks and reading bedtime stories, staying up late when she had a cough just to make sure she was breathing steadily. I remembered all the little things, the invisible things, the things no one ever thanks you for, the kind of love you give because it's woven into your bones, the kind that doesn't ask for recognition but still hurts when it's ignored. I turned off the tablet and sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the trees were bare. The wind carried a chill that made the windows creak. I listened to the house settle around me, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the occasional crack of old floorboards. Everything was still. Everything was ordinary. Except now, something inside me had shifted. It wasn't just about a party. It was about erasure, about being left out of a moment I should have been part of, about not being seen. I stood up slowly and walked into the kitchen, made another cup of tea, even though I didn't want it. Just something to do with my hands. I thought about calling them, asking why, pretending I had seen the pictures by accident, but I knew what the answer would be, or rather, I knew the tone, the casual brush off, the shallow apology, the "we thought it would be too much for you," or "it was all so last minute," words designed to soothe, not explain. I didn't want to be soothed. I wanted the truth, and I suspected I already had it. There comes a moment late in life when you realize the space you occupy in people's lives isn't always the one you think. You assume love means inclusion. You assume history means respect. But sometimes people write you out of the story while you're still sitting in the room. I placed the untouched cup of tea on the counter, walked back to the living room, and sat down again in the chair by the window. The light was beginning to fade. The sun hung low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I watched the golden beams stretch across the rug, slow and certain, indifferent to anything happening in my heart. I had given them everything I had, and they had given me silence, not even the courtesy of forgetting, but the cruelty of remembering and choosing not to care. The next day, I tried to behave as if everything was normal. I brewed strong black tea, added lemon and honey, opened my old planner as if I had things to do, as if something waited for me outside my home. But it was all a hollow performance, staged by me for an audience of none. The truth was, I didn't want anything. Not to read, not to cook, not to listen to the news. I moved only because standing still would have meant admitting just how deeply I had been hurt. I spent a long time sitting by the window, watching the neighbor's dog chase red leaves through the yard. Autumn had fully arrived, and each gust of wind pulled down handfuls of gold and copper from the trees. I remembered how, years ago, Lucy and I had collected maple leaves together, pressed them into old-school notebooks, and made a scrapbook. She called me Grandma Marty then, and she ran barefoot through my backyard like a forest fairy. I would stroke her hair as she fell asleep on my chest and think that maybe the whole point of aging was to become someone's quiet anchor. Now all that remained of those evenings were memories and a small handprint on my window that I couldn't bring myself to wash away. I thought about my granddaughter-in-law, a sharp woman with a bright voice and sharper eyes. There had never been warmth between us. She always looked at me with a smirk, as if searching each of my words for hidden criticism. I never argued. I complied. I helped. I bit my tongue when she demanded I babysit 3 times a week because she didn't have time for a nanny. I did everything they asked, and more. And now, apparently, I wasn't important enough to be invited to the birthday party of the little girl I had sacrificed so much for. Maybe I had become inconvenient, old, too quiet for their vibrant world filled with parties, posts, Instagram stories, and curated photo shoots. I didn't fit into their new circle. I wasn't a trendy grandma, didn't know how to make videos, didn't show up in filtered stories. I was just available when needed until it was no longer convenient. They called when they needed help, but when it was time for joy, the joy wasn't for me. I imagined their laughter, the applause, the candles being blown out. I imagined someone asking where I was and how my granddaughter-in-law might have replied casually, "Oh, she couldn't make it," or "We thought it'd be too crowded," probably with a smile, the kind of tone that eliminates any trace of guilt before it's even formed. Because guilt, after all, requires a sense of wrongdoing, and they felt none. They were certain they'd done the right thing. And so there I sat, alone, surrounded by the silence of a house that had once echoed with my son's first cries, my granddaughter's first steps, Lucy's first giggle. This house, every corner of which was steeped in the history of our family, now felt like it belonged to someone else. I had become a guest in a place that used to be mine. I recalled a woman from a book club I once led at the library. She said, "Loneliness isn't when you're alone. It's when you're among your own and still feel unnecessary." Back then, it sounded poetic. Now, it was simply accurate. I turned on the television to fill the silence. An old sitcom was playing, and the canned laughter crackled through the speakers, mechanical, identical, unnerving. It grated on my nerves, like someone laughing in the next room at a joke I didn't understand. I muted it, but the screen kept flashing, playing scenes from someone else's life, joyful, carefree, just like those pictures. They laughed, and I sat outside their world, separated by invisible glass from the people I loved. And in that quiet beyond that barrier, I had only one thing left to understand: why everything I had done was no longer enough. The answer didn't come, only exhaustion, heavy, thick. I stood and slowly made my way to the bedroom to change into my robe. On the way, I stopped by an old dresser, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a dusty folder. Inside were papers I hadn't touched in years. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for truth, and I found it among those gray lines and faded ink. They had forgotten me, but I remembered everything. And now, that memory had a price. The next morning was unusually quiet, even for my house. I woke early, long before the sun rose over the empty trees, and sat at the edge of my bed for a long time without moving. I wasn't tired, but I wasn't rested either. My body felt heavy, as though every part of me had been weighed down with memories I hadn't asked to carry. I pulled my robe around my shoulders and shuffled down the hallway, slippers brushing softly against the hardwood floor. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle and turned the stove on low. The quiet hiss of the flame was the only sound. I didn't turn on the radio that day. I didn't want to hear other people's voices filling my home with noise I couldn't relate to. The kettle boiled, and I poured the water into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle and faded roses. I dropped in a tea bag and sat down at the table to wait, watching as the water darkened slowly, a small swirl of color in the middle of the cup. I didn't drink it right away. I let it sit. Instead, I opened the old drawer by the fridge and pulled out a bundle of documents. They had been tucked away years ago, mostly untouched, folded and refolded until the corners had softened. I laid them out carefully on the table. Deeds, loan agreements, a trust form I barely remembered signing, the notary's stamp still visible, the ink smudged by time. I ran my hand over the pages, the paper cool beneath my fingertips. I had always kept good records. I was never the kind of person who ignored the fine print. When my husband passed, I had taken over everything: bills, bank statements, medical forms. Even after my son grew up, Even after my granddaughter moved in with her new husband, I kept the habit. I filed things, I labeled, I documented. I never liked relying on memory alone. Memories shift, but paper doesn't lie. The tea had gone cold by the time I reached for it. I took a sip anyway. The bitterness caught me off guard. I set the cup back down and turned my attention back to the forms. There was a copy of the agreement I had signed years ago when they needed help with the down payment on their home. My granddaughter had been pregnant at the time, and they were struggling. They came to me one evening with hopeful eyes and tired voices, asking for help. They promised it was temporary. They promised I'd never regret it. I had believed them. I had wanted to believe them. So I offered my savings as collateral. Not all of it, but enough to tilt the balance with the bank. I remember the conversation with the loan officer. I remember the warning. It makes you a co-signer, ma'am. If anything goes wrong, you're legally tied to the debt. I nodded, signed, and tucked the copy away in my file. I never mentioned it again. I didn't want them to feel indebted to me. That wasn't the point. But now, sitting there with that paper in front of me, I saw it differently. Back then, I thought I was helping them build a future, but it wasn't a future I was ever meant to be part of. Once they had the house, the furniture, the backyard for Lucy to play in, I became less necessary, less visible. I wasn't the foundation anymore. I was the scaffolding, meant to be removed once the structure stood on its own. I flipped to the next document, a letter from my lawyer dated 2 years ago. We had created a revocable trust for my estate, including the funds I had put aside for emergencies. At the time, I had asked her to include a clause, something I had insisted on after overhearing a careless comment from my granddaughter. I wanted protection, not from strangers, but from the people I had loved the most. It had seemed paranoid then. Now it felt prophetic. I traced the line in the document with my finger. The wording was precise. In the event of neglect, exclusion, or breach of verbal familial commitment, the trustee retained the right to reallocate or withdraw financial support. A quiet clause, one sentence buried in a sea of legal language, but it was enough to act, enough to take back the power I had forgotten I still held. The house was technically theirs, but the financial cushion that kept them afloat, the buffer between stability and collapse, that was still tied to me. I gathered the papers and placed them back into the folder, not roughly, not with anger, just with clarity. I stood, rinsed out my untouched tea, and let the water run for a while, the stream steady and cold. Outside, a bird landed on the fence, pecked once at the wood, and flew away. I watched it disappear into the branches of the maple tree, now bare. The wind pushed against the windows in slow gusts, rattling the old panes. That morning, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt quiet, like a woman who had been sleeping and had finally woken up. They had forgotten me, left me out of the picture, erased my place at the table, but I had not forgotten them, and paper, unlike people, remembers. I moved through the rest of the day with a stillness that felt unfamiliar, like walking through water where everything is heavier and slower, but strangely clear. There were no frantic decisions, no emotional outbursts, only small, quiet steps. One at a time. I knew that whatever I chose to do next would not be loud. It didn't need to be. The loudest things I had come to learn were often the ones said in silence. I opened my old address book and found the number I hadn't dialed in months. My attorney's name was written in fading blue ink, slightly smudged from years of flipping pages. I stared at it for a while, then picked up the phone and called. Her voice on the other end was calm, professional, with just enough warmth to remind me why I had trusted her with everything. I told her I needed to revisit a clause we'd discussed before, the one we had written quietly, almost hypothetically, as a safeguard. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She simply said she would begin the process. I spent the rest of the morning going through my files, organizing, reviewing, making copies where needed. I worked slowly, deliberately. The rhythm of sorting papers, clicking open folders, and sliding documents into place gave me a strange peace. There was something comforting about touching paper that carried weight, legally, emotionally, historically. It was a kind of proof, a record that I had existed, that I had contributed, that I had mattered in tangible ways. By mid-afternoon, I had everything I needed packed into a large envelope, sealed and labeled. I placed it near the door, where I wouldn't forget to take it to the post office. Not urgent, but timely. It needed to arrive before the end of the week. There was no rush, no threats, only timing. I brewed a second cup of tea, this time actually drinking it while it was warm. I sat on the back porch wrapped in an old shawl, letting the wind play with the ends of my sleeves. The sun was soft, pale, beginning to dip. I watched the shadows stretch across the backyard where Lucy once played. I could still see her there, in my memory, chasing butterflies with wild hair and bare feet. I smiled, but it didn't reach my chest. Later, I pulled down the old safe from the top of the hallway closet. Inside were things I hadn't looked at in years. Letters from my husband, photos in faded color, his service medals, birth certificates, account statements, the original deed to the family house. I laid them out on the bed like evidence in a quiet case. Not against anyone, just for me, a reminder. My life had been made of 1,000 quiet choices, and this would be one more. I typed a letter that evening, not to them, to the bank, to the trustee, to the insurance company, each with its own tone, professional, measured, complete. I printed them out one by one, signed them in blue ink, folded them carefully, and sealed the envelopes. They sat on the corner of my desk, heavy with intention. After dinner, I walked around the house turning off lights, one room at a time. The click of each switch echoed in the stillness, a small punctuation mark at the end of a long day. In the bedroom, I opened the window just a crack to let the cool air in. I liked sleeping with the breeze, even if it made the room colder. It reminded me I was still alive, still breathing, still capable of change. I pulled the covers up to my chin and stared at the ceiling, where faint moonlight painted shifting patterns through the trees. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know how they would react. Maybe with anger, maybe confusion, maybe nothing at all. But I knew that the world had started to turn differently now. I had nudged it, gently but deliberately, back into alignment. Not out of revenge, not even out of pain, but because silence has a weight. And sometimes, the only way to survive being forgotten is to quietly remind the world that you are still here. I didn't sleep easily, but I slept knowing that I had moved. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with purpose. The morning arrived with a sharpness in the air that cut through the windows before I had even drawn the curtains. I woke early, again, long before the sun touched the treetops outside my bedroom window. There was a different rhythm to the house that day, still quiet, but no longer heavy. I moved slower, not because of fatigue, but because I wanted to be deliberate with every step. I was no longer floating through days waiting to be remembered. I had done something, even if no one knew it yet. I sat at the kitchen table with a fresh cup of tea and stared at the steam curling upward like a ribbon. On the other side of the window, the trees were bare, their branches thin and exposed. The last leaves had fallen overnight, littering the lawn with a blanket of amber and brown. It was the kind of view that used to make me nostalgic, but now it made me feel something else: readiness. I thought about all the years I had given, all the small sacrifices that were never noticed. Late nights spent folding laundry that wasn't mine. Grocery bags carried up flights of stairs so someone else wouldn't have to. Birthday cards bought and signed on behalf of others, just so no one would feel forgotten. I had been the quiet hand behind so many gestures of love that were claimed by other people, and I had never asked for credit. I didn't want a stage. I just wanted to be seen. I thought about Lucy again, how she used to hold my finger with her whole hand when she was small, how she used to fall asleep in the crook of my arm like it was the safest place in the world. I wondered if she would remember that, or if her memories would be edited by those who thought I had outlived my usefulness. Children remember what they are told to remember, and I no longer trusted the storytellers. I replayed moments that had seemed trivial at the time I dropped everything to pick up my granddaughter from the airport when her flight was delayed and her husband couldn't come. The day I canceled my own doctor's appointment to watch Lucy because they forgot to book a sitter. The time I loaned them money for car repairs without asking when or if it would be paid back. None of it had been grand or dramatic, just the steady drip of love offered without condition. And in the end, it had been taken for granted like a faucet that never runs dry. Now, with the trust frozen, the accounts under review, and the financial support they relied on temporarily suspended, I imagined the calls they might be making. To the bank, to each other. I imagined the confusion giving way to annoyance, and then perhaps, eventually, to fear. And I wondered if they would think of me in that moment, not with warmth, but with recognition. Recognition that I had been more than a convenience, more than a name on a check, more than a background figure in their curated lives. I didn't feel guilt. I had given them everything I could, and then more. What I was doing now was not retaliation. It was clarity. I was lifting the veil of assumption they had draped over me, letting them see the shape of my absence, not just in their home or their parties, but in the very foundation of their comfort. The mail arrived mid-morning. I stood at the front door for a moment before opening it, listening to the faint hum of the delivery truck as it drove away. Inside the small stack of envelopes was a card. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My granddaughter's, loopy and fast. I opened it slowly, carefully, like it might carry something fragile. Inside, a photo of Lucy at her party, her mouth open in a wide, joyful laugh, her cheeks pink with sugar and excitement. Below the image, 3 words: "Wish you came." There was no explanation, no invitation, no apology, just 3 words that dripped with performance, not meant for me, not really, meant to create a record, meant to say they had tried. I set the card aside and returned to my tea. It had cooled again. I drank it anyway. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook from the drawer next to the phone. I hadn't used it in years. It still smelled like old paper and dust. I began to write. Not letters, not statements, just thoughts, memories, fragments, truths. I wrote about the small ways people disappear from each other, not through explosions, but through erosion, through 1,000 missed calls, forgotten birthdays, unspoken thank yous. I wrote because it helped me understand that I hadn't been erased all at once. It had happened in increments. And now I was simply pulling myself back together in the same way, quietly, deliberately, word by word. By evening, the sky had turned to ash. A dull gray stretched across the horizon, and the streetlights blinked on, one by one, like tired eyes opening in the dark. I lit a candle in the hallway, not for mood, but for warmth. Something about the small flame made the house feel less empty. I didn't expect a knock on the door. I didn't expect flowers or voicemails or sudden tears. People who forget don't remember just because they're reminded. Sometimes they double down, rewrite, pretend it was always this way. I had no illusions. But I had something better. I had the past, intact. I had proof. I had pages that bore my name, signatures that couldn't be undone, documents that spoke when I no longer could. I had the power to decide what came next, not for them, but for me. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The morning after the trust was frozen, I woke with a strange clarity in my mind, as if something heavy had finally shifted just enough for me to breathe deeper. The house felt colder than usual. I pulled on a thicker sweater and made my way to the kitchen. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I preferred the gray dawn filtering in through the windows, soft and unjudging. I made tea again. It had become more ritual than refreshment lately. Boil the water, select a bag, pour, steep, wait. I stood at the counter as the scent of chamomile rose into the air. My fingers tapped lightly on the ceramic as I stared out the window at the brittle November trees. Nothing had changed on the outside. The street looked the same. The mailbox stood as it always had. The world didn't know what had happened, but I did. I sat down at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around the warm mug, and I waited. Not for a knock or a call or a headline. I waited for the feeling that would come next, for regret maybe, for doubt, but none came. What I felt instead was steadiness. That's what surprised me most, not the silence from them, but the quiet inside myself. Mid-morning, the first call came. The phone rang 3 times before I picked it up, glanced at the screen, and let it ring itself out. My granddaughter. I watched her name disappear from the screen like a tide pulling back. Minutes later, another call. Her husband. I let it pass, too. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't punishing. I just wasn't ready to entertain a scramble of excuses and confusion. Whatever conversations came next, they needed to begin somewhere other than desperation. I turned off the ringer. The rest of the day unfolded in slow motion. I did the laundry, folded sheets, dusted the baseboards, wiped down the picture frames in the hallway. Lucy's face smiled at me from one of them. Taken years ago at a pumpkin patch, her cheeks smudged with dirt and joy. I paused there for a long moment, not because I was sad, but because I wasn't. That photograph reminded me of a time when everything still felt real, when I was more than a favor or a background figure. I remembered how tightly she held my hand that day, how she insisted I carry her even when she was perfectly capable of walking. That weight had once been the most precious burden in the world. By afternoon, the silence on the other end of the calls turned into texts, then emails. I didn't open them. I didn't need to. I could imagine their content, panic laced with politeness, concern wrapped in justifications. I had been alive long enough to know the cadence of regret when it was born of consequence rather than conscience. Around 4, I saw their car pull up outside. They didn't get out, just sat there in the driveway for several minutes. I stood behind the curtain, watching without revealing myself. Eventually, the passenger door opened. My granddaughter stepped out holding a small box. She approached the porch, paused, and set it carefully by the front door. She didn't knock. She didn't look around. She returned to the car, and they drove away. I waited a while before opening the door. The box was wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. There was a card taped to the top. I didn't open it immediately. I brought it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and made another cup of tea. Only after sitting down again did I peel the tape away. Inside the box was a photo album, a new one. On the first page was a printed picture from Lucy's birthday party, one of the ones I had seen online, except this one had been edited, cropped, carefully reframed. In the new version, the angle was wider and I was in the background, blurred, unintentional, but visible, a ghost in the frame. I closed the album. The gesture didn't anger me. It didn't warm me either. It felt like a placeholder, a pause before a real sentence. They were trying, in their way, but I wasn't ready to decide what that meant yet. I spent the rest of the evening in the living room, curled up under the same knit blanket I had owned since before my granddaughter was born. The television stayed off. I lit a candle and listened to the wind brush against the windows. They had always assumed I would be here no matter what, that my presence was a given, like a porch light left on just in case. But porch lights don't burn forever. They dim, they flicker, and sometimes they are turned off intentionally. That night, I slept without dreams. Just a stillness that came from somewhere deep, like a stone settling into place. Something had changed, not in them, in me. I wasn't waiting anymore. It started with a listing. I saw it by accident, really. I wasn't searching for it, just browsing out of habit, scrolling through the real estate section of the local paper while sipping my morning tea. But there it was, the house, their house, the one I had helped them buy, the one they had filled with new furniture and glassy white smiles, the one I hadn't been invited to for almost a year, listed with bold letters that read, "Motivated sellers, priced to move." My eyes didn't leave the page for several minutes. I reread the listing again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less final. But they didn't. The address was unmistakable, the same tree-lined street, the same number etched into my memory from forms and envelopes and bank paperwork I had filed away long ago. My hands rested on the table, fingers trembling slightly, not from shock, but from something quieter, confirmation. I folded the paper and placed it beside my tea. The warmth had long since faded. Over the next few days, the listing spread online. A photo of the exterior, fresh white siding, a wreath still hanging on the front door, flower beds carefully manicured. On the surface, it looked like a happy home, but I knew better. It was a house built on convenience, on assumptions, on the fragile scaffolding of silent expectations. It was a house paid for in part by a woman they no longer saw as necessary. And now it was for sale. Rumors travel fast in small towns. By the end of the week, a neighbor mentioned it in passing while we stood outside pulling weeds. She didn't know the details, just said it was strange, sudden. No for sale sign had gone up in the yard yet, which made the whole thing seem rushed. She asked if I had heard anything. I shook my head and changed the subject. I didn't need to hear the details. I knew what had happened. Without the trust funds accessible, without the financial safety net they had come to rely on, they had slipped into something they hadn't planned for. The mortgage payments were likely too high to manage on their own. The lifestyle they had maintained, the school tuition, the new car, the backyard renovations, had never truly been theirs to afford. It had been borrowed, not just from banks, from me. And now the illusion was unraveling. Part of me expected them to reach out again, to explain, to offer context. But after the card and the photo album, nothing else came, just silence. I imagined they were too embarrassed, or too angry, or maybe they still didn't fully understand how everything had changed so quickly. But I did, because I had seen it coming for years. the casual requests that became expectations, the emotional distance that grew with every favor fulfilled. They had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a function, an account, a convenience, a background figure, until I wasn't. And when that function ceased to serve them, their world tilted. I wasn't gloating. I didn't feel triumphant. In truth, I felt a kind of grief, not for the house, not even for them, but for what it symbolized. It had once been a promise, a new start, a shared belief in something stable. And now it was just a paper house, crumbling at the edges because no one had cared enough to reinforce the foundation. The idea that they might have to leave it, the living room with the tall windows, the nursery I had helped paint, the kitchen where I had once stirred soup while Lucy sat on the counter, swinging her legs, felt surreal, but there was no undoing it. Paper doesn't cry, it just folds. I wondered if Lucy understood what was happening, if she noticed the tension, the hushed arguments, the sudden change in routine. Children notice more than we think. I imagined her asking questions, sensing the stress in the air, missing things she couldn't quite name. I hoped they would be honest with her. I hoped they wouldn't make me the villain in their story. But even if they did, I knew the truth would remain in the spaces between the facts, in the documents signed, the dates recorded, the balance sheets adjusted. I hadn't acted out of spite. I had acted out of necessity, to remind them, and perhaps myself, that support is not the same as obligation, that love is not license. The listing stayed up for weeks, price reduced. Then again, open house this Saturday. Each update like a heartbeat, marking the slow retreat of a dream they never fully appreciated. I watched from a distance, not through binoculars or gossip, but through the quiet certainty of someone who had already mourned the loss long before the walls began to fall. I didn't need to drive by. I didn't need to peek through windows. I had lived through the dismantling already, in phone calls not made, in invitations not sent, in names not spoken. It was never just a house. It was proof. Proof that even the sturdiest structures will collapse when built on a foundation that forgets who laid the first brick. The house was quiet the way only old houses can be, filled with the gentle hum of settled dust and ticking clocks, the occasional creak of the floorboards like a whispered memory. I had begun to enjoy the silence again, not as a void, but as a presence. It surrounded me gently, like a shawl pulled tight around my shoulders. The noise of their lives, of need, of expectation, of casual dismissal, had faded into something distant, and I didn't miss it. My mornings became rituals of choice. I woke when I pleased, sometimes early, sometimes after the sun had already brightened the hallway. I opened the curtains slowly, letting the light fall in slanted lines across the hardwood. I brewed tea not because someone needed it, but because I wanted it. I sat in my robe longer, let the warmth of the cup stay in my hands, and watched the world from my kitchen window, no longer waiting for anyone to knock or call or remember. The garden needed tending. The weeds had begun to push their way up through the soil again, as they always did this time of year. I pulled on gloves and dug my hands into the dirt, the smell of earth grounding me in the moment. I planted bulbs I had been putting off for seasons, not for someone else to admire, but simply to see what would bloom. The act of care without audience, without transaction, felt sacred. Inside the house, I moved room by room, clearing out things that no longer felt like mine. Boxes of hand-me-downs, stacks of cards with names that had grown hollow. I wasn't angry. I was ready. Each drawer emptied felt like an exhale. I donated what could be used, recycled what couldn't, and burned a few letters in the old fireplace just to feel their weight lift into the smoke. I started writing again, not in the strained, hopeful way I once had, letters begging for reconnection, emails left unanswered, but in my own voice, short stories, fragments of memory. I filled pages with thoughts I hadn't shared with anyone in years, some joyful, some sad, some uncertain, but they were mine. I wrote in the evenings when the light turned soft and golden and the house seemed to breathe with me. One afternoon, I walked to the lake. It wasn't far, just past the school where I used to volunteer. The path was quieter now, lined with bare trees and benches worn smooth by time. I sat for an hour on a bench near the edge of the water, wrapped in a scarf, the wind cold against my face. Ducks floated by, unbothered by anything. A father jogged past with his child in a stroller, music playing softly from his phone. Life moved on, and I let it. At the store, someone asked me how I was. I smiled and said I was fine, and for the first time in a long time, it was true. I didn't launch into updates about the family or try to disguise the fracture with practiced lines. I let the conversation stay light, simple. I was learning that not every silence needed to be filled, that not every absence required explanation. They hadn't called in weeks. I didn't expect them to. The initial wave of shock had passed, and I imagined they were busy rebuilding whatever version of life they could piece together without me. I didn't know where they were living now. I didn't ask. If they wanted me to know, they would tell me. And if they didn't, I would be fine not knowing. I wasn't bitter. I was done. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop holding space for people who treat your presence like a placeholder. I had spent years folding myself into the margins of their lives, always careful not to take up too much room. Now I was unfolding, quietly but fully, into the center of my own story. I found a new book at the library, a novel I'd been meaning to read for years but never made time for. I checked it out, along with two others. I sat in the reading nook by the window, a blanket over my knees, and let myself disappear into someone else's words. The sun shifted across the pages. Hours passed without urgency. That night, I lit a single candle on the dining table, made a simple dinner for one, and poured myself a glass of wine. I didn't feel lonely. I felt whole. The quiet was mine now, not a sentence to endure, but a punctuation mark I had earned. I toasted to no one and to everything, to the life I had built, to the boundaries I had claimed, to the time that was finally mine.